Hi, everybody. Welcome to Soul Food Salon. We are so thrilled and excited that you're here today to help us celebrate Earth Day, the 50th anniversary. What a perfect time to do this. My name is Jeannie Rosner, and I'm the founder of Soul Food Salon. So a little bit about me for those who don't know me. I'm a retired pediatric anesthesiologist, and I've now been teaching health and wellness classes in our local middle and high schools for the past 9 or so years. And about 7 years ago, I started Soul Food Salon. And essentially my mission is to educate and empower us all to be healthier, with ultimately the planet being healthier. So my mission being to educate people. We do these events, at least historically they've been in-person events in my community in Woodside, California, where I feature health and wellness experts once a month, either doing a talk or doing a cooking demonstration. And that was prior to COVID-19. And now, since our social distancing has begun, we've been hosting some virtual salons. This is our third one, and hopefully today's tech will go smoothly. And just a few more things before we get started. So I have a website, soulfoodsalon.com, and there you can find everything that we have done in the past. Past salon events are up there, with PowerPoint presentations, recipe presentations, anything that we've written is up there. So I keep it very current, so check it out. Again, soulfoodsalon.com. And then I'm also pretty active on social media, on Instagram, Facebook, YouTube. Everything is at Soul Food Salon, one word. So please follow along and share my content with your friends and family. But today's event is being videotaped, and I will upload the video as soon as I get it to YouTube, and then share it with my audience. And I'm going to share it with my biggest email audience, which is my Soulful Insights email list, which is basically a health and wellness newsletter that we put out a few times a month. If you're not on that email list, you can get on that list by going to my website, and you can click a link to put your information in, or you can email me, jeannie@soulfoodsalon.com. Or you can actually check YouTube in the next day or two and look under Soul Food Salon, and you'll see the video up there. So before I introduce Brett, let me share with you how we're going to proceed today. Brett will do his presentation, and when he's finished, we will do a Q&A. However, you can feel free to ask Brett questions throughout the presentation on the Q&A format in the bottom of your screen. And however, Brett will not answer those live during the presentation. We have a few people behind the scenes on this call, and they are going to help answer some of the questions as they go along. However, at the end, we will do a live Q&A with some of the questions that perhaps haven't been presented. There is a chat function at the bottom of your screen. We will be pushing out some information through the chat function, but it won't be anything that you can truly interact with us. So your interaction with us will be through the Q&A. So let me introduce Brett now to us. So Brett Jenks, I'm very excited to introduce him to you all. He is the president and CEO of RARE. Brett took an interesting path to where he is today. He started out in journalism and then moved into film production before he committed his life to the environment. When he was in his 20s, he moved to Costa Rica and launched a variety of conservation projects and partnerships. And this led him to taking the helm at RARE at the age of 33. So for the last 2 decades, Brett has built RARE into a leading behavior change organization in conservation and sustainable development. Under his leadership, RARE has built numerous award-winning programs, including Fish Forever, a program focused on protecting vital coastal ocean waters and the communities that depend on them, and a cornerstone of Bloomberg Philanthropies' Vital Oceans initiative. In 2017, Brett received the Rose Walters Prize from Dickinson College, whose past winners have included Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Elizabeth Kolbert, actor Mark Ruffalo, former head of the EPA Lisa Jackson, and climate activist Bill McKibben. I'm pleased to welcome Brett Jenks to Soul Food Salon. Take it away, Brett.
Thank you, Jeannie. Thanks so much for having us, for welcoming the RARE family into your salon. What an interesting time. We are in the middle of a global pandemic, celebrating the 50th anniversary of Earth Day, and it would take just personal connections like our mutual friend, Christy Patterson, to bring together this whole group to talk today. COVID-19 is the greatest example of individual human behavior change, at least in my lifetime. And despite its harrowing impacts, I think it's a great lesson for all of us in just the power of our individual behavior to move the meter, to make real change that benefits everyone as we flatten this curve. And so today I want to talk to you about climate change and behavior change and individual behaviors you can adopt that will make a huge difference over time. I hope that by the end of this conversation, you feel a little more optimistic about climate change and that you even set a few intentions to make some changes yourself. That's the goal. So let's have at it. I'm going to start off with just a quick introduction to RARE. RARE is a global conservation organization. Here's our 8-word mission statement. RARE inspires change so people and nature thrive. We have been doing this in 60 countries around the world, more than 450 different campaigns, all designed to change the behavior of millions of people in order to influence farming practices, fishing practices, the way that protected areas are designed and managed. And we have millions of data points that are testament to the ability of people to change in order to benefit both themselves and the natural resources on which they depend. COVID-19, as I mentioned, is just an unbelievably harrowing, challenging, anxiety-inducing phenomenon. If there's any silver lining, and it's hard to even say that in the context of this crisis, for an organization like ours, it's the proof, clear proof that humans can very quickly change behavior, not just out of personal self-interest, but with a mindset towards the collective good. I think that's such an important thing to be reflecting on at this time, given that arguably the greatest global health crisis facing humanity is in fact climate change. According to the IPCC, there are 400 million lives threatened by climate change over the next couple of generations. And we ourselves have our own opportunity to flatten the curve, and that's what we're going to talk about today. You know, COVID-19 is very different from climate change, but there's also a number of really stark and fascinating similarities. One of the things that's so educational, I think, about COVID-19 from a climate change standpoint is just how influential our personal behavior can be. I mean, as you reflect on the conversations you've had over the last couple of months, you know, one thing we see very clearly is that we change when we see other people change. Seeing change around us gives us permission to make change in our own daily lives in order to address a common problem. You know, I found myself saying things like, you know, this is really crazy. My God, I've washed my hands 20 times today. I'm getting obsessed with hand washing. That's such a 6-week-old, you know, or even older idea. Seeing change also gives us insight into the potential solutions that really make a difference. You know, talking with other colleagues, we've had conversations like, so we established a travel ban. We got everybody a new Zoom license and upgraded them beyond the 40 minutes. And, you know, we're making cuts and figuring out how to preserve cash. That behavior gives everyone else license to have similar conversations and change their behavior. You know, and then finally, we don't recognize how quickly individual action leads to changes in our own identity, even in very subtle shifts. You know, we think about, for example, saying things like, no, of course we're not going out. Of course we're not going to come see you. Of course we're not going to get together. It's not just about us not getting sick. We don't want to get you sick. We want to flatten the curve. So I'm taking action so that we can all benefit. This is very new in a number of ways. And I think it's quite educational. Keep that in mind as we talk about the role you can play in flattening a frankly, long-term, much more serious health-threatening curve, which is that of greenhouse gas emissions. So that's sort of our wind-up. Last thing in terms of getting started, before I tell you a bit about what RARE is up to. Quick poll. Using that question and answer function, just share one word, and Zach will read out a handful of them. How are you feeling about climate change right now? When you think about climate change, seated where you are today, what's one word that comes to mind? Assuming that's working, Zach, let me know, but I'd love to hear some of those responses.
Yep, we've got them coming in, so I will start reading out some samples. We have a couple people who say hopeful. I see concerned, afraid, confused, pretty terrified, depressed, anxious, urgency, that we can reverse it, scared, wonder where I can move, imbalanced. So it's definitely, it's kind of running the gamut.
Oh, thanks, Zach, and thanks to all of you for just sharing a little bit. I mean, it's hard to figure out how to actually meaningfully communicate back and forth. Hopefully we'll do a good job of that in the Q&A section. But Yale's program on climate communications does a survey and has for a number of years now. And here's the response that they heard to this question after all the data was processed. 31% of Americans are currently alarmed, and 26% are concerned. Now, for those of us on this call, those may seem like low numbers, but actually those are really significant upticks in the percentage of Americans that are alarmed or concerned. What's also positive about this data, which is only a few months old, is the notion that the dismissives and the doubtfuls are waning. Those numbers at 10% and 10% are much lower than they used to be, which should give us a sense of how the country has changed just in the last few years. According to Yale, in a similar study that they ran, 72% of Americans believe that global warming is happening. That is a remarkably high number, given some of the other kinds of polling data that we all see on a regular basis today. Rare did its own poll recently, and we found that 55% of Americans actually want to do something, are looking for a way to do something. In fact, expect to be asked to do something, expect other people to do something. The problem is nobody seems to know what to do. In that same poll, we found that the number one response to the question, what can you do? You the people, what can you do to make a difference on climate change? Fully 60% of the people had as their first response, recycle. Now that's a credit to the recycling industry, but it's not even a top 25 climate change solution. Still good for the environment, but not really moving the meter. The second most popular response was use less plastic, which is a result of some great campaigns and awareness raising that's been going on around plastic usage. But using less plastic is also not a top 25 solution to climate change. But maybe the fact that people want to do something but don't really know what to do is the opportunity that we can exploit. So how do we answer that question? What can I do to address climate change? What would actually move the meter? We spent a lot of time talking about this over the last year. We embarked on a body of research, and we decided to answer the question slightly differently. What can an American do in their daily lives, individually, that will measurably reduce, if adopted by enough people, the US greenhouse gas emissions? And could we, for example, pin that metric to the US commitment under the Paris Agreement to reduce by 26% by 2030 US greenhouse gas emissions? So that was the goal. I was in Paris for those negotiations in 2015, and it's fair to say we celebrated wildly below the Eiffel Tower after winning what we thought was the sort of ultimate policy victory. Hundreds of countries dedicating themselves to similar reductions. Here's where we are today. We haven't accounted for COVID-19 and the 5% drop recently in greenhouse gas emissions, but I think you get the point. We are woefully, as a country, off target. But that's really the end of the bad news, at least for this presentation. And from here on out, we just see lots and lots of opportunity for us, starting with this. We identified in our study 7 behaviors that, if adopted by just 10% of Americans, would get us back on track to hitting our target under the Paris Agreement. Restoring US leadership on this critically important issue globally, and giving everyone on Earth a sense that we can, in fact, solve this problem. So I'm going to come back in just a few minutes. We're going to walk through these 7 behaviors. But before we do, I want to give you a sense of how we think about behavioral science and how motivating in some ways it can be. For those of you who live near Gene out in Silicon Valley, you might recognize this cafe on Stanford's campus. 2 postdocs, Greg Sparkman and Greg Walton, were social psychologists standing outside this cafe in late 2017 to conduct an experiment. And I want you to just listen carefully to how they conducted the experiment and what they learned. They offered everybody entering this cafe a $5 voucher in exchange for a quick conversation. The voucher let them not only incentivize folks to participate, but also track the expenditures after the conversation. To the control group, the researchers said, did you know that 30% of Americans are considering eating less meat? To the experimental group, and listen carefully, they said, did you realize that 30% of Americans have already started eating less meat? They wanted to compare the difference in reaction to your peers are considering with your peers have already started. And surprisingly, at least to me, the people who heard 30% of Americans have already started literally bought 50% less meat in the hour after that quick conversation. There's something magical about the idea that your peers, your colleagues, your friends, fellow Americans have already started doing something. This is called a dynamic norm. It's sort of like the idea that from an evolutionary biology standpoint, nobody wants to get left behind. You know, we all grew up watching National Geographic. You know what happens to the antelope that gets left behind the herd. And we feel that psychologically. You know, there's another saying, well proven, I think this study was done on Stanford's campus as well back in the 60s. We know that people don't flee the theater because they see smoke. People flee the theater because they see other people fleeing the theater. And so the power of dynamic norms is something we want to leverage as a strategy for helping 10% of Americans get this snowball effect in motion. So what are these 7 behaviors? We've organized them A to G, so you can pass Gene's test at the end of the month. A is for adopt a plant-rich diet. That does not mean you need to become vegan or vegetarian. It means, well, recognizing that eating less meat is actually really good for you. Here's the protein scorecard from our colleagues at World Resource Institute. And I think what you can see here is just the significant health, economic, and climate change benefits that come from actually eating a plant-rich diet. Because at the end of the day, this is how Americans eat. What you see here are 5 quintiles, each one of them representing 20% of Americans. This quintile on the right shows that 20% of Americans eat the equivalent of about 3.5 hamburgers per day. That's their meat intake. On the left, there's 20% of Americans who eat the equivalent of about 1/2 a hamburger a day. Our goal is to get 10% of Americans to simply shift 1 quintile to the left. And that gets you that little sliver in the chart that I showed you earlier. B, we're up to B. A is adopt a plant-rich diet. B is buy carbon offsets. Now, we don't think this is necessarily the first thing everybody should do, but there's certain things that you're not going to be able to get out of your carbon diet either. And so eventually there's going to be a role for people to buy offsets. There's really 2 problems with offsets, though. One, no one knows how to calculate their carbon. It feels like going to the dentist or filing your TurboTax paperwork. And even when people do know their carbon footprint, people tend, especially the more knowledgeable they are, the more skeptical they are about where that money goes, even though it's a tax-deductible donation. You know, what are these carbon offset projects? You know, whether they be clean cook stoves or community tree planting or different ways of measurably, meaningfully reducing or offsetting your own carbon footprint, we have a challenge of making people more comfortable with this idea of the general idea of offsetting. There's a couple of really interesting opportunities here. One is, what if a technology could enable you in 1 click to calculate your carbon, and in another click to actually buy an offset? So 10 seconds, 2 clicks, know your footprint, and you're carbon neutral. There's another opportunity here with just in pricing and the expectations. Most Americans have no idea how inexpensive it is to buy a carbon offset. The average American could offset their entire carbon footprint for about $145 per year. We're going to come back to this, and I'm going to show you one actual product in development right now to help with this problem. But that's A, adopt a plant-rich diet, B, buy carbon offsets. C is contract for green energy. And in this regard, we're really talking about two things: signing up for renewable energy in your home, or going the full bore and installing rooftop solar. Again, there's a misconception here about the cost of this kind of energy. The cost of solar panels since 2008 has gone down about 80%. 97% of Americans wildly overestimate the cost of green energy. So there's some additional opportunities here. It's also pretty fascinating to think about what pushes adoption. What has been motivating the adoption to get us to the point where 4% of American households have rooftop solar. That's way higher than I expected when we started doing this research. These researchers in Connecticut studied this clustering phenomenon you see visualized here. And they carried out a series of surveys and experiments to figure out whether it was political viewpoint that would cause this clustering in the adoption of solar, whether it was demographics, whether it was income level. It turns out it was none of the above. What's most fascinating about rooftop solar is it's contagious. Again, here, dynamic norms at play. If you install solar, if you put in charging stations for EVs, you're way more likely to see that contagious effect. D is for don't waste food. This is less about a purchase and more about a practice, but significantly more than 40% of food waste is residential. What many people don't understand is that food waste is such a huge source of greenhouse gas emissions, because when you just throw away your food waste and it ends up in a landfill, well, it doesn't decompose the way it might in a composting bin or in your backyard. What happens is it goes anaerobic and creates methane. And methane is at a minimum 30 times more potent a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. So actually, food scraps and food waste in your home is a really big source of greenhouse gases in the United States. So here's another small behavior change with a big potential impact. E is for electrify your vehicle. And this is something that's quite common now in California, slowly catching on in the rest of the country. What many people don't understand is just that when you look at the cost of ownership in its entirety, when you take a rebate and then you look at a resale value and then you look at savings from not having to purchase gas, a Tesla Model 3 is comparable to a Toyota Camry over a 5-year period. And yet we see EVs as elite status symbols rather than practical decision-making, which they are increasingly becoming. And there's also a host of models out there that there weren't just a handful of years ago. To that elitist issue, I think there's also some really promising bright spots, like one in California that is focused on making EVs much more affordable and available to lower income families because they are a sound economic decision long-term. F is for fly less. And our view is, why not start off with flying once less? Now this sure looks a lot easier than it did 8 weeks ago, given the fact that I'm not in California today meeting with you in your salon. We, like every other meeting we have all day, and even our family gatherings and our quarantinis, take place over Zoom or Blue Jeans or Google Hangouts or the like. So there's a big opportunity here to get this kind of behavior to stick. And we're working on a strategy here as well. So that's A through F. And that gets us by 2025, those first 6 behaviors, if we can get 10% of Americans to adopt them, gets us 75% of the way back on track to hitting our target under the Paris Agreement. Now, we want to be crystal clear that we're not advocating herein for avoidance or ignorance of the political process that's required to ultimately get comprehensive climate legislation passed in the United States. That's probably the most important thing we can do. The same way that I would say, but given our experience with COVID-19 over the last 8 weeks, look at how corporations and individual behavior change gave politicians permission to get much more stringent and to adopt these lockdowns that have everybody feeling much more comfortable being at home because it's actually the rule. There is a significant role to play for behavior change in warming up society, because most political leaders don't actually lead, they just scurry ahead of the pack, looking over their shoulder, making sure they're out in front. That's what politics is all about. If we run in this direction, my belief is they will follow. They may stay right out front and draft ahead, you know, the way a dolphin might out the front of your boat. So G is get engaged. And by get engaged, we mean get engaged socially and get engaged politically so that your behavior gives you a megaphone of influence for all of your friends. And this is something that's actually really fascinating. When you see people wear masks, you're way more likely to wear a mask. When you say you're going to make a change and social distance, it makes it so much easier for other people to do it. Well, the same is true of these behaviors. There's a lot of social science that validates this point, that you are way more effective a communicator and way more credible a communicator than almost any climate expert out there. Your neighbors, your friends, your colleagues will take your viewpoint over, you know, Bill Nye the Science Guy anytime. Now that's frightening when you think about it, and we probably shouldn't behave that way, but that's human nature. That's who we are. We trust people in our neighborhoods. We trust people in our friends' circles. And so that means you have a great deal of influence, way more than you think you have. So the question then becomes, if we've identified 7 behaviors, and if those 7 behaviors, if adopted by 10% of Americans, gets us 75% of the way there, and then eventually could help us close the entire gap by creating the kind of movement in America that would be apolitical and enable an on-ramp for a whole new group and constituency of Americans, then the remaining question is, so how do we do this? How do we bring this about? We have one really simple answer, and that's we need to meet us where we are. We need to meet Americans where we are. And this is one of the most important sets of insights from behavioral science. If we can meet people where we live, you know, consider there are 50 cities that house 50 million Americans. There are, let's say, 30 million employees of the Fortune 500 companies. And there are 136 million Americans that have bank accounts or credit cards. There are just through cities, through corporations, and through our bank accounts, there's a way to touch hundreds of millions of Americans with a pretty simple message that we, the people, can make a really significant difference. So I know that's not a huge insight, but that is high level our strategy for getting 33 million Americans to move in this direction. So let's talk about some examples of what that might look like. What's the go-to-market strategy? What are the products we envision? We're focusing on an array of scalable solutions. I'll talk, for example, about the Make It Personal hometown. Imagine a network of locally run, city-based campaigns in partnership with sustainability directors. Right now, we have interest from the head of sustainability of Los Angeles and of Montgomery County outside of DC, and of Arlington County right outside of DC, of Charlottesville, and we haven't even begun to market this opportunity. So from some of the largest cities in the country to some of the most progressive, there's a great deal of interest in this idea of, how do we make this change? Let's make it personal. Let's make it personal Austin. Let's make it personal Los Angeles. You can also imagine within these corporations, and frankly, we have a lot of evidence and a lot of surveys and polling that shows this was a really good idea about 3 months ago, pre-COVID-19, and that was to begin to offer green benefits packages that would include some of these behaviors for a whole host of Americans through the corporate benefits program. And that's something we're going to return to just as soon as the economy begins to come back. because we think this creates a competitive advantage for employers and a great incentive for moving the meter collectively. I'm going to give you an example, though, of probably the most advanced of these early Make It Personal ideas, and that's with what we're calling carbon counts for mobile banking. And rather than talk you through it, we'll just show you a quick demo video to give you a sense of what's possible.
Meet Miguel. Miguel is concerned about the environment, worried about climate change, but he's not sure how his everyday purchases actually impact his carbon footprint. One day, Miguel is using his bank app and notices this little green note. Suddenly, he's digging into the data, his actual impact data. Every single one of his transactions, all rolled up into his own personalized carbon footprint.
Did I really eat burgers that many times this month?
He is relieved that it's only $30 to buy carbon offsets.
Yep, offsetting this month's impact. I'll do that.
And he makes a mental note to do better next month. Miguel is not alone in the effort. He begins to get suggestions that are tailored to his life. Miguel drives a lot. Here's the top 3 recommended EVs we picked to save you money and reduce your impact. And here's a financing option. And tomorrow, we'll send you a coupon for lunch. Maybe you should try the new salad bar around the corner. Together, we can do this. Visit rare.org/makeitpersonal for more.
So that rounds out a quick introduction to give you a sense of some of the opportunities that each of us as individuals have to make a difference, to literally move the meter, both personally through that carbon calculator you just saw, but in aggregate, collectively, we can move the meter on climate change. I think it's a really fascinating time given this pandemic that we're all living through right now. Despite the harrowing challenge that it presents, we see it as a great opportunity for reflecting on the immense power of human behavior change to address a collective action challenge. We're flattening the COVID-19 curve, and you'll see today the head of the United Nations and op-eds in Politico and elsewhere talking about finally talking about the great opportunity we have to take climate change from the abstract policy realm, from the technical realm, into a more personal one, to be able to make a difference in our daily lives that will benefit us individually, but more importantly, it will bring huge benefits to us collectively. Just flattening the curve a little bit can literally save millions of lives over the next couple of generations. At the end of the day, we're talking about a threat to 400 million people. And it's surprising to me that we're only really beginning to realize that we, the people, just with our own basic lifestyle choices, have such an important role to play. So if you're interested in learning more, I hope you'll visit rare.org/makeitpersonal. And we'll close with just a sense of our own evaluation. So of the behaviors that you just heard about, let's just have a one-word response. From those of you in the audience, before we have a Q&A and a conversation, which of these 7 behaviors are you interested in pursuing as of today? Zach, I'm assuming you're going to help me out with this one.
I'm back. A couple of great responses. A couple of people saying all of them. That's pretty awesome. But plant-based diet, driving an electric vehicle, getting solar. So I think the lesson here is that there's something for everybody, depending on people's situation. Not to mention the people that may have already adopted one or more of these behaviors.
Yeah, no doubt in this crowd, there are a lot of you who have already have the clean slate. And then the question is, how can we get an even bigger bang out of your own personal behavior? And that's where this behavior G, getting engaged socially, social media, in your own networks, following Jean's lead here, pulling us all together to have this conversation. So with that, I simply want to reiterate my gratitude to Jean for bringing us all together, to Christy for making the connection, and then to each of you for spending a little time with us. I think we've got time left. If we want to jump to Q&A, I'll just make one final plea to check us out. If you want to get involved or help, we're game. We probably have a lot to learn from all of you as we embark on this effort. So over to you, Jean, and thanks again.
Great. Thanks, Brett. So that was really inspiring and wonderful to have as an intro to our 50th anniversary of Earth Day. So thank you. So we got a couple questions, and I'll start with one from our illustrious mutual friend, Christy Patterson. She asks, are there any current federal policies or discussions happening at the federal level that we should be aware of in the context of some of these personal choices?
Well, I think the answer is yes, and it's a pretty difficult time to be talking about anything seriously, given just what's at stake right now, on Capitol Hill. I think every time the one party has tried to introduce some green tint to one of these COVID-19 bills, they've been pretty flatly rejected. And I think I know in a couple of cases, Nancy Pelosi has just removed that that call as part of a trade-off. There's an array though of state and federal policy opportunities that would help escalate adoption of many of these behaviors. But that's probably a longer discussion than we have today. But there are a number of really exciting opportunities out there.
Great. Okay. So on a maybe more existential level, what do you think this virus, this COVID-19 virus, is here to teach us?
I find it absolutely confirming, having worked for 25 straight years, measurably, with a significant body of evidence, literally millions and millions and millions of data points. I find it highly empowering, and it gives me great hope and optimism that it is now irrefutable that Americans can change their behavior very quickly in some really significant ways. And I hope that it doesn't, so that's one. Two, it's confirming from a behavior change standpoint. Two, I think there's a significant set of differences. Climate change is a slow, for people like us who are in a relatively privileged role to be able to be on a Zoom call today, in the middle of our day, and to be forward thinking about these kinds of issues. I think it's fair to say that climate change doesn't necessarily impact us today the way COVID-19 might and can and is. It's a slow moving train wreck, but it has so many similar features. It is a threat to hundreds of millions of people. It is an enormous threat to our economy. And there is a role for the federal government, as we see. There is a role for the state government. And there is an enormous and absolutely ignored heretofore role for individual behavior. Washing hands is to driving an electric vehicle as social distancing is to adopting a plant-rich diet. I mean, there's a menu of individual behaviors that follow a very similar pattern. I think at a deeper level, and I tried to allude to these without getting too heavy-handed, some of the behavioral insights, this notion that we give each other permission to behave, right? If I do something and let you know about it, you're so much more likely to follow suit. In some ways, my behavior creates the expectation that you're going to behave differently as well. We're still, as humans, coming to terms with our own social psychology. And it's easier for us to see it in other people than see it in ourselves. But this is a very new arena. We're the first at RARE to start a center for behavior and the environment. It's only 2 years old, and we're the first. This is uncharted waters, but I think without going on and on, I'll just say it is a crisis. Climate change is the most significant public health crisis to ever face our species. And I hope we're learning what's possible.
Okay, great. How did you guys come up with the 7 actions as having the most impact?
Good question. So we started with Paul Hawkins' book, Drawdown. And I remember several of us read it over the holidays, over a year ago. And we had this sort of collective aha. And we said, we had just launched the Center for Behavior and the Environment, and we have changed behaviors of millions of people in 60 countries. And we asked ourselves, so we've never worked in the United States. Could we take what we're learning about, what we've learned over the decades about behavioral science, and apply them to the Mac Daddy of all environmental challenges and all public health crises, and that's climate change. And it just seemed so ambitious and ridiculous that we kind of laughingly said, I don't know, what would the behaviors be? So Paul Hawken's book Drawdown has a list of 80 to 100. It's sort of a desktop book. I highly recommend it. And it basically lists the 80 to 100 things that humans need to do. And so we said, well, let's start with that list because it's a really compelling list. And they had a lot of data behind it. They did some real research to come up to validate the hypothesis that those are the 100 most important things. So then we asked, what are the most salient and significant potential individual behaviors? Because that's just not the lens that anybody brings to this problem. So we cut them from 100 to 30, and we published a little report. Statistically speaking, we said these are the 30 most important ways. And then, there's a great body of research that points to choice overload. No one is going to behave differently when you give them a list of 30 things to do. And I thought to myself, well, 7 is a pretty good number because that's the number, of when we used to all have to remember phone numbers, when we were kids. 7 was the magic number. And there's a body of research theoretically behind that. I don't think we validated that, but I think we believe that. So we said, so what are the handful of behaviors, statistically speaking? And so the ones we've listed are literally, statistically, the most significant individual behaviors you can adopt in order to move the meter personally. So for folks I would imagine who are on this call, buying a carbon offset, since you can offset 100% of your impact, is statistically speaking the best thing you could do, but it's not the most satisfying. What's probably more satisfying is to install rooftop solar, convert to an electric vehicle, drive on sunshine. That alone, for most people, if you own one home and 1 or 2 vehicles, is probably going to cut off almost half of your greenhouse gas emissions. And so there's a whole report on our website that will back up those assertions.
Cool, great. So let's just go into the carbon offset a little bit. So what makes a carbon offset a quality offset?
So there are a variety of third-party certifiers who have built up standards, and measurement standards over the years that point to a handful of variables that really matter. Probably the most important one is a term called additionality. The idea is if you plant a tree because you've been required to plant a tree, that's not additional. But if you plant a tree as part of a project that is financed through a carbon offset facility, through carbon credit purchases, then it is additional. So meaning if not for the money that you have provided in buying an offset, the project would not exist. That's probably the most important one, other than some of the really obvious ones, which are that they're verifiable, that someone is actually counting the carbon, that there is a science behind, for that species of tree at that latitude and longitude in that kind of soil, you can expect this kind of carbon sequestration, this kind of drawdown into the soil. But of course, you can imagine there's a gold standard. There's a variety of different standards out there. One of the groups that we use to source offsets is called Cool Effect. In fact, several of the pictures that I showed you in that slide are from the Cool Effect website, and I probably should have credited them right down there in the lower right-hand corner. They are very rigorous with the process procedures that they use for validating and then using third-party verifiers to be able to account for that carbon. And RARE actually offsets all of our emissions once a quarter through Cool Effect. And so we believe in them, and we're using them and in the back end to source our offsets as we get this thing up and running.
Great. So when a couple questions have come in concerning the video that you posted with Miguel, what is the status of moving forward to have that technology where we can actually really verify what our carbon output is and how we can offset it?
So we built a demo in the fall and took it out to a host of financial technology institutions, commercial banks. We are currently in negotiation with a couple of different outfits with the goal of building that technology, for which we have also filed for patent protection, into a banking experience. We know that if we were just to create an app, it would get lost in the sea of apps in the Apple Store. Even on most people's mobile phones right now, there are 100 apps, and you probably use 25 of them on a regular basis. And most of them you clean out like you do your garage, once or twice a year. And so we want to be able to build that technology into, again, under the theory of meeting Americans where they are, into an experience, real time. So what are the next few steps? RARE is exploring the idea of actually commercializing that enterprise, spinning it off as a for-profit technology company. And we're beginning to discuss with some potential investors what we believe to be a very promising opportunity. So Carbon Counts could become a public benefit corporation and still be a partner in this ecosystem called Make It Personal that we are building out. So those are some of the next steps. We're really excited about the opportunity.
Great. Okay, one maybe final question. I'll just pose this to you. So when we return to our new normal after this virus passes, we have the power to decide what that new normal can be. And how do you envision that to look?
I think that's the million-dollar question right now. I think it's a great one. And we're spending a lot of time discussing within RARE what is the messaging and what is the glide path and what are the toolkits that will enable us to take advantage of some of the changes that we've already made. So for example, we are engaged in a conversation, have had a couple of conversations now with, for example, this platform with Zoom to figure out what we could do together. And I don't want to go into it, but there's some pretty exciting opportunities and ideas there. If you think about food waste, I would say in my household, we are managing our refrigerator better than we ever have in our lifetimes. I feel like I'm walking the admonitions of my mother-in-law who grew up during the war in France and who has never wasted a chicken wing in her entire life. And we are living that ethos right now out of purpose and also out of a seeming sense of urgency and necessity. How do we continue that practice? What does that look like? So while I think there's a handful of these, while we're at home, can we get people, we sort of want to rush to market a few of these ideas. Can we get people while we're in this mindset of serious, take away the anxiety and the fear, but serious sense of obligation and purpose and duty and intention, and can we leverage that so that the new normal is something we communicate, with our personal megaphones. And so one of the challenges making, how does my management of my refrigerator become observable? How does me buying an offset become an observable behavior? How does me deciding to fly less? I tend to travel as CEO of a nonprofit to raise money or to do program development or to go call on donors or partners. Think of how much money out there is spent on sales forces going out. Well, is there a way to save money in this new normal? And now that we've all experienced, so many people for the first time, being called upon by your solar salesperson or a fundraiser, or having a corporate board meeting this way rather than in person, there's so many opportunities here. We've got to figure out how to what's the opportunity to make it easy to continue with this new normal. And so we're exploring a whole host of ideas right now. I should say this is very early days for Make It Personal. This isn't RARE's been around a long time. This is a startup within Make It Personal. We are actively pursuing our initial funding, our initial partnerships, and building a suite of pilots around, for example, a carbon calculator and a one-click offset purchase, a glide path to green benefits in your own workplace, a way for you to think about the practices of reducing food waste in your home. So, as we said to you when we first met, Jean, I think we'd love to learn from you and your network as you continue to explore with your speakers and with your salons, all that you're learning in the process. So have at it.
Awesome. Thank you. I think that's it with the questions that we've had. I hope everyone's been inspired. I know I have, and I've learned a ton. As I mentioned, we will have this recording available on YouTube at Soul Food Salon, hopefully in the next day or so. Follow soulfoodsalon.com on our website. This will be all this information, and Brett's PowerPoint presentation will be available on the website as well. And you could reach me, Jeannie, at Soul Food Salon if you need to. You can reach out, hopefully follow Rear now. They're on social media as well. Be the megaphone to alert everybody about what you're doing and what committed practice, behavior change that you perhaps want to make. And let your neighbors know. Put up those solar panels and buy that electric car and adopt that plant-based diet. So with that, I think we'll conclude. So thanks again, Brett. This has been wonderful.
Jeannie, I know your name's Jeannie. I want to thank you finally with your correct name. I apologize, but thanks for hosting us, Jeannie. This was a great conversation. I hope people got something out of it. Cheers. Thanks.
Thank you. Cheers to everybody. Happy Earth Day.